we are going to get started with our third session, which is entitled Literature 1. And to start with, we have Maria Luisa Bernardini, who lives in Tuscany, a city near Florence. Maria Luisa graduated from the University of Siena and obtained a PhD from the University of Florence. Her fields of study are archaic Greek lyric poetry and the intersection of poetry and prose in 5th century Athens. She became passionate about these studies because she believes they can still teach something important in the 21st century. And she now teaches in the Liceo Classico Francesco Petrarca. Sorry, I have a 3-year-old in the background bouncing on my bed at Arezzo. So please take it away.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you so much.
I'm in Tuscany Valley, where connection not always is good. This is the question. So I see. Come? Can you see the screen? Can you see the screen?
I'm afraid not. No, there should be a button down the bottom of your screen. I think it should be highlighted in green. There we go. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah, we have your slides up. Yeah, there we go. Wonderful.
Thank you. I'm sorry for my not fluent English, but I'm so happy to be here with you. So I will speak to you about Euripides and Antiope, about the rising of intellectual between tradition and new political instances. Among the works of Euripides, the Antiope occupies a particular position. The tragedy, written towards the end of the 5th century BC, in fact, has come to us in fragments, incomplete. However, various clues reveal that this theatrical drama received a wide consensus in antiquity, in particular for the central theme of its famous agone. Discussion, battle of words, in which Euripides elaborates the theme of the opposition between bios practicos and bios theoreticos, between a way of life marked by action and one that is more meditated and dedicated to reflections. It is the first time that this theme has been treated in literature and will have a broad development both in literature and in philosophy. If on the one hand the style and themes of the Antiope are fully inserted in the complex evolution of Euripidean production, on the other hand a specificity stands out which illuminates it as a very particular tragedy, and this seems to offer confirmation of the remarkable fortune obtained in the time. We find the themes in Aristotle, with the formulation of concept of bios politikos, political life, in Seneca, which addresses in the Otio and the Tranquillitate Animi the problem of whether or not a scholar should participate in political life, until reaching Augustine of Hippo, who reflects on vita negoziosa or actuosa. Most of the fragments have come down to us through in indirect tradition, above all thanks to anthology of the Stobaeus, but the passages of the Agone between Amphion and Zetus, inserted in anthology in Plato, in the dialogue entitled Gorgias, are worthy of special mention, as they constitute a precious source for reconstructing the Zetus speech in the contrast with his twin brother, and together with other traces that emerge in the Platonic dialogue, signal a presence of the tragedy that is anything but occasional and limited to those quotations, supporting the hypothesis that the Antiope can even be considered a subtext of the Gorgias. The discussion between Amphion and Zetus was centered on the theme of Bios Aristos, the best life. Zetus reproaches his brother because he thinks Amphion wastes his time in useless activities, indeed harmful, by stealing time from those really important for a man, while Amphion claims the importance of music and virtue, stating that his way of life is not only not harmful, but is useful to the polis, the group of citizens who not only live in a place, but who also recognize themselves in a political order. In the words of Amphion is reflected the importance of the figure of the poet in the early Greek civilization, in which the poet was not only a lover of music and poetry, but was also the bearer and propagator of knowledge. The myth presents Amphion as a protos poietes, the first poet. He received the lyre directly from Hermes and Euripides.
I'm afraid your audio is cutting out. We've only had a couple of words in the last few minutes. Can you hear me?
As a poet of the archaic tradition who recites a cosmogonic hymn, a representation that tends to push the situation back in time as a sort of mythical bird of song and poetry, placed in a mythically remote era. Other elements give an emphasizing coloring to the Antiope. They are acquired from archaic poetry, and for their intertextual significance are used by Euripides to make this tragedy full of meaning. It contributes to this name, for example, the revival of a module of archaic poetry in fragment 910 now, whose assignment to the Antiope is conjectural but accepted by most scholars. The passage occupies a particularly relevant place within the group of Euripidean fragments, not only for the intrinsic importance of the tragic dictation, but also for the considerations to which the background of the poetry invites. The passage, in fact, reveals to be full of intertextual references and branches out consequences that will continue to live on for a long time in subsequent literary and philosophical production. The scholars who assign this line to Antiope enhance the fact that in the passage there is a vibrant praise of the man dedicated to speculative research. These verses, presumably, are to close the battle of words between Amphion and Zetus. This reconstruction lacks reliable evidence, but in the surviving verses of the Agone attributed to Amphion, the concept of Olbos, blessing, cornerstone of fragment 910, returns with insistence. Therefore, after the end of the passage in which the two brothers opposed their different lifestyles, it is probable that the choir recited these verses. Olbios ostis tes historias estematesin, mete politon epipemosinen, meteis adicus praxis hormon, alathanatu catoron physios, cosmon ageron, petes ineste caiope caiopos, tois de toiutos udepotais cron ergon meletema prositei. Blessed is who possesses the knowledge derived from research and does not harm himself to harm his fellow citizens or to commit unjust actions, but contemplates the imperishable order of immortal nature, in what way it was constituted, and from where and how. Such people never approach the practice of shameful actions. It is a macarismos, a lyric passage in which someone's happiness is declared on the basis of a particular situation considered privilege. In this passage, the praise stands out of those who consider it happy and at the same time worthy of a prosperity granted by the gods, Olbios, because he has embarked on the path of knowledge. He is enabled to err, to harm, and commit unjust actions. Research devoted to knowledge is accompanied by a behavior that excludes damages and injustices. From the words of the poet, the practice of historia research appears to be an integral part, not yet perched in the splendid isolation in which it will be relegated to later times. This proud attestation of awareness is substantiated by Euripides, one false poetic strategist, the aim of which is to add nodal concept to the words used to establish a scientific philosophical language, and at the same time, as we will see, recalls the authority of poets such as Hesiod and Pindar as an endorsement of the message entrusted to these verses. Such a representation of research imposed itself and proved paradigmatic to the point of living for a long time in ancient thought. The main witness of fragment 910 is Clemens Alexandrinus. He quotes these verses to compare the beliefs of those who pursue knowledge with Plato's statement that he who contemplates ideas will live as a god among men. In addition, a little further on, Clemens, in the fourth book, mentioned fragment 911 now, a lyric piece attributed by scholars precisely to the Antiope. The one who speaks in these verses declares to have golden wings on his back and the winged sandals of the sirens, which will allow him to rise in the ether to unite to Zeus, a suggestive image that cannot fail to refer to Plato's famous description of the soul as a winged chariot. In our fragment, therefore, Euripides closely connects the practice of Sophia, wisdom, and a life marked by righteousness, which finds its proposition in the will not to commit injustice. Theory does not end in knowledge, which authorizes those who practice it to contemplate the truth, but find its fullness in respect for relationships. From a formal point of view, fragment 910 takes up well-known models already belonging to archaic poetry and presents point of contact with the more well-known macarismoi, even if it is immediately distinguished from these precedents, since in the verses of Euripides, the happiness of the sea is not attributed to a revelation or to a knowledge of initiatory character, but in search. The transition from the mystery religious sphere to the strictly scientific one is evident in the Euripidean verses, but despite the essential distinction between the knowledge derived from religious revelation, as in Pindar, and the due to personal investigation, Euripides using a style typical of the initiatory religious sphere appears to transfer the initiatory character of the research in a conscious way, as if to declare that the investigation is talking about is not for everyone, but only for those who have made a sort of approach path, a real initiation. The one who pursues the historia, the search for the first causes, contemplating the imperishable order of immortal nature, is equated with the mystes, one who already knows the religious mysteries. It is not surprising that Euripides places this celebration of research in a tragedy that has among its main reasons the apology of the musicos, the singer, or poetess, the poet. It too, with his ways and means, for example, composing and reciting cosmogonic hymns, in turn pursues an investigation into nature, and therefore fits by right into the initiatory category of who is obvious as he seeks the truth. Beatitude, moreover, since Hesiod was the prerogative of those protected by the Muses. In Greek literary history, the figure of Macarismos has a long history and is used for different purposes, but I consider it to be of particular interest the comparison with the Macarismos discloses the erga of Hesiod, a text very familiar to the ancient Greeks of all age. In fact, the text reads like this: blessed and happy is he who, knowing all this, works without guilt towards the immortals, observing the flight of birds and avoiding transgressing. In these verses, placed in great prominence at the end of the Erga, the happy condition of those who, having acquired the knowledge of what the poet expounded in his work, is celebrated, acting while avoiding being guilty towards the gods. He knows their wishes and does not transgress the rules. He is anaitios, unguilty. Euripides, intentionally linking fragment 910 to these verses, places it in a light in which moral integrity and knowledge, inseparably connected, contribute to happiness. As for the meaning of the research prized in the verses under consideration, the term historia of the first verse used to define the investigation of the order of the nature recalls the philosophers of the Ionian world. This fragment is the only tragic place where the term historia is found, which therefore does not belong to the tragic lexicon, while it already appears well established in the field of scientific speculation. All scholars starting from Valkynair onwards agree in seeing in these verses the influence of Anaxagoras, even if the influence of other philosophers is not excluded. However, we must not forget that so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, in their attempt to explain nature, didn't not neglect the intention of finding a moral order that would support reality. The theoretical commitment lavished by Euripides in Antiope and its centrality for subsequent semantic conceptual evolutions is also highlighted by Benedetto, who, analyzing the participle "cathoron," who contemplates, emphasizes that the verb, from the archaic use of looking from above, reaches with Plato a technical philosophical value that expresses the typical aspect of human investigation, and the scholar identifies the intermediate stages of this semantic path in Pindar and in fragment and 910 of Antiope, where, with a sublime elevation, whoever embarks on the path of knowledge comes to look at the imperishable order of immortal nature from above. In conclusion, in fragment 910, archaic motives and stylistic features operate. Among them, an important depth is recognized towards Hesiod and Pindar, with whom Euripides creates an intertextual relationship, substantiated by lexical and metaphorical references aim at regaining the prophetic function of the poet and to the enhancement of an action both poetic and political, which is capable of producing well-being of polis. In turn, Euripides fixes the image of the man devoted to speculation, coloring it with initiatory character, just as a process of initiation into the mysteries is required, so the approach to the truth of nature postulates a path of introduction that finally makes the scholar not only able to understand natural phenomena, but once contemplating the eternal order of truths, also able not to commit injustices. Therefore, accepted the membership of fragment 910 now to the Antiope we can see the reason why this tragedy was received with such a lasting appreciation. In addition to possessing a plot capable of arousing the interest of the public, from what emerges from the intertextual lesson, the Antiope is configured as a fundamental junction, both artistic and intellectual, at the crossroads of topics, styles, and thoughts in full evolution at the time of its composition. In addition to the very famous and almost proverbial logon, Euripides' reflection on the poet as the engine of the political life of the polis, and as an educator, stand out according to the form of archaic thought in which the transmission of culture was entrusted to the poet. In an attempt to recover the poet from a position undermined by the new educators, the sophists, who proposed themselves as teachers and guides of the youth destined to become the future ruling class. Euripides is linked to the contents and styles of a poem of a high moral caliber, creating connections and references that cover the Antiope with an archaizing patina. These links propose a message both new and ancient, filled with those values which were challenged by the rationalist skepticism of intellectuals at the end of the 5th century BC in Athens. The profuse speculative commitment of Euripides testifies once again that it is completely inserted in the topicality of the philosophical discussion in his time, so much so that he had the nickname of Skenikos philosopher of the scene. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. We do have one question before we move on to our next presenter from YouTube. So what was the conclusion? Should a scholar be involved in politics or not?
Yes, they are very in politics, but the poet is intrinsic in the city, not out, not in the ivory tower. It is in the city and guide the city, is the educator of the young until the sophists began the guide of the new youth.
Thank you so much.
For now, I think that a poet would be, we need a poet in the city, a poet who will be a guide and not only a bearer of verses. And now the best poets are today even prophets. They see the reality before other people when it's a real poet. Euripides was a real poet. He looks at its society and understands what a beautiful baby.
Thank you, sorry.
Compliments, greetings. Excuse me for my not fluent English.
But, your English is immensely better than my Italian, so please don't apologize.
We can in the future will do a change.
Well, thank you again. That was truly fascinating.